James Walker sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling fields of Lexington, Kentucky. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. But James was too lost in thought to admire the view. His daughter, Amanda, had pushed him too far this time. The file on his desk confirmed what he already suspected. His private investigator had uncovered the truth. Amanda was dating some reckless troublemaker from Chicago, a man with no future and no sense of responsibility. James clenched his fists. He had given her everything: privilege, education, and a life most people could only dream of, and yet she insisted on rebelling against him at every turn. Ever since his wife had passed away, James had taken it upon himself to ensure Amanda was protected. The world was a dangerous place, and he would not allow his daughter to throw her life away on a foolish romance. This was about more than just a bad boyfriend. This was about respect. James exhaled sharply. If Amanda refused to learn through words, then he would have to teach her in a way she would never forget. A lesson that would force her to understand the value of discipline and responsibility. His gaze darkened as a plan took shape in his mind. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Daniel, I need to talk to you," he said when the line connected. Daniel, the estate's gardener, had been working for James for years. He was a quiet, hard-working man, always dependable and never asking for anything beyond his wages. He had no interest in luxury or ambition beyond his simple life. And that made him the perfect pawn for James's plan. A few minutes later, Daniel arrived at the office. He knocked politely before stepping inside, removing his cap as a sign of respect. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Walker?" he asked, his voice calm but hesitant. James studied him. Daniel was in his early 30s, rugged from years of working under the sun. He was the exact opposite of the kind of men Amanda was drawn to: unassuming, humble, and completely uninterested in wealth or status. That was precisely why James had chosen him. "Yes, Daniel. I have a proposal for you," James said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It concerns my daughter, Amanda." Daniel frowned slightly, clearly confused. "Amanda?" James nodded, his expression serious. "I assume you have noticed her behavior lately. She has been reckless, making poor choices that could destroy her future. Cannot allow that." Daniel remained silent, though the concern on his face deepened. Everyone on the estate knew Amanda. She was beautiful, intelligent, and undeniably strong-willed. She had a sharp tongue and an even sharper temper. She needs to learn responsibility, to understand that life is not just about doing whatever she pleases. James continued. "So I have decided that she will marry you." Daniel froze. For a long moment, he looked as if he had misheard. "Marry me?" he repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. "Yes. You are a good man, Daniel, honest, hardworking, and grounded. Amanda needs to experience a life outside of privilege, and you can show her that." James paused before adding, "Of course, you will be well compensated for this." Daniel stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I am just a gardener. Amanda does not even like me. This does not feel right." James waved a dismissive hand. "It is not about feelings, Daniel. It is about discipline. You will be doing her a favor in the long run. She needs to grow up, and you will help her do that." A heavy silence filled the room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window as if looking for an escape from the situation he had just been thrust into. "I do not know, Mr. Walker," he started, but James cut him off. "This is not a request, Daniel. Neither of you have a choice." Daniel lowered his gaze, understanding that there was no point in arguing. When James Walker made a decision, it was final. That evening, Amanda returned home, walking through the grand entrance of the mansion, completely unaware of what awaited her. Her heels echoed against the marble floors as she made her way inside, oblivious to the storm brewing. James was waiting in the sitting room, seated with an air of authority that made Amanda instantly wary. "Amanda," he called as she passed by. She sighed, already irritated. "What now, Dad? I am not in the mood for another lecture." James stood, his expression stern. "There will be no more lectures. You have made your choices, and now you will face the consequences." Amanda folded her arms across her chest, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? You are getting married." Amanda blinked. "Excuse me?" To Daniel, the gardener, James said, his tone unwavering. Her shock turned into fury in an instant. "What? Are you insane? You cannot be serious." "I am very serious, Amanda. The wedding is in 2 days. You will marry Daniel, and maybe then you will learn what it means to live in the real world. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of disbelief and anger. Amanda had fought back with everything she had, pleading, arguing, even threatening to leave, but nothing worked. Her father's word was final. On the morning of the wedding, Amanda stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, staring at herself. The white dress she wore was simple, nothing like the elegant gown she had always imagined. Her hair was pinned up neatly, but there was no excitement in her eyes. No joy, no anticipation. Only a hollow sense of inevitability. I cannot believe this is happening, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. Her reflection stared back at her, expressionless. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting a golden hue over the estate's vast gardens. It was the perfect day for a wedding, at least, for a willing bride. But for Amanda, it might as well have been storming. She felt trapped, forced into a marriage that was nothing more than a lesson in obedience. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. It was her father, of course, ensuring she had not changed her mind or attempted to flee. Amanda, James's voice was firm as he stepped inside. It is time. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with defiance. You know this is wrong. You know that, right? James's expression remained unchanged. It is for your own good, Amanda. In time, you will see that. She clenched her fists, swallowing the scream that clawed at her throat. There was no point in arguing anymore. She would go through with it, but she vowed silently that her father would regret this decision. As she descended the grand staircase and stepped into the garden where a small group of guests had gathered, Amanda felt the weight of the life she was about to enter pressing down on her. A life with Daniel, a man she barely knew, certainly did not love, and had been forced upon her. It was humiliating. Yet there was no way out. Daniel stood beneath the floral arch, looking just as uncomfortable as she felt. Dressed in a simple suit, his normally rugged appearance softened by the formality of the occasion, he still had that quiet, unshaken demeanor. The calmness irritated her. How could he just accept this? The officiant waited, smiling warmly as if this were any other joyful wedding. Amanda had to resist rolling her eyes. There was nothing joyful about this. She barely listened as the ceremony began, her mind filled with thoughts of escape, anything to avoid the future being forced upon her. Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts as he spoke his vows. His tone was steady, his eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, she saw something unexpected. He was not happy about this either. Of course, he was not. Why would he be? He had not asked for this any more than she had. Yet, he was here, doing what was expected of him, just like she was. When it was her turn to speak, the words felt foreign on her tongue. I do, she whispered, barely audible. And just like that, it was done. She was now Amanda Walker. She did not even know Daniel's last name. As the ceremony concluded, the small crowd clapped politely, but there was no joy in their applause. This was a transaction, plain and simple. Amanda's gaze found her father, standing with his arms crossed, a look of satisfaction on his face. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had destroyed her life. But instead, she fixed him with an icy glare. Daniel stepped forward, offering his arm as they walked back toward the house. Amanda hesitated before taking it, the gesture feeling forced and unnatural. They walked in silence, neither knowing what to say. Once inside, James wasted no time laying down his expectations. You will move into the guest house, he said in a businesslike tone. It is modest, but it will suit you both. Amanda's expression darkened. Of course, it is modest. That is the entire point, isn't it? James ignored her sarcasm. You will live there together as husband and wife. It is time you learned what life is really like. Amanda wanted to argue, but the weight of the day had drained her. Instead, she simply nodded, resigning herself to her fate. Daniel remained silent, his expression unreadable. She could not tell what he was thinking, but she did not care. She just wanted to be alone. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the guest house, leaving her father and Daniel behind. The guest house was small compared to the mansion, but still larger than any place Amanda had lived outside of her family's estate. As she stepped inside, the reality of her situation pressed down on her. This was her new life. No more luxury, no more control over her own future. She was stuck here, in this house, with a man she barely knew. Daniel entered a few moments later, closing the door softly behind him. I am sorry, Amanda, he said quietly, his voice almost hesitant. I know this is not what you wanted. Amanda spun around, eyes flashing with anger. What I wanted? None of this is what I wanted. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. But I guess that does not matter. Does it? We are stuck in this now. Daniel nodded, his face somber. I suppose we are. For a long moment, they stood in silence, neither knowing how to move forward. The weight of their forced union hung heavy in the air. Amanda knew that no matter how much she fought, nothing would ever be the same again. Amanda woke up the next morning with the same sense of anger and disbelief. The small guest house, with its modest decor and simple furnishings, felt nothing like the mansion she had grown up in. Gone were the silk sheets and floor-to-ceiling windows. In their place were plain white curtains and a creaky bed. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. But the sound of clinking dishes in the kitchen reminded her that this was real. She was married to Daniel, the gardener, and there was no escaping it. With a frustrated sigh, she tossed the covers aside and made her way to the bathroom. Splashing cold water on her face, she stared at her reflection. Her hair was messy, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. She barely recognized herself. This was not Amanda Walker, the confident, carefree woman who could bend the world to her will. This was someone else, someone trapped. When she stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was already sitting at the small table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He glanced up at her, offering a hesitant smile. "Good morning," he said softly. Amanda ignored him, opening the fridge to grab a bottle of water. She was not in the mood for small talk, least of all with the man who was now, legally, her husband. It did not matter how considerate he was. She had not forgotten why they were here, and she had no intention of making this easy for him. "You should eat something," Daniel said, his tone gentle. "I made eggs." Amanda looked at the plate of scrambled eggs he had set on the table. It looked fine, but she had no appetite. Amanda took a long sip of water before setting the bottle down on the counter with a loud thud. "I am not hungry," she said flatly. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable, and returned to his coffee. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, the weight of their situation lingering between them like an unspoken truth. Amanda could feel his gaze on her, but she refused to meet his eyes. She needed to get out of the house to escape the suffocating feeling creeping over her. Without a word, she grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door and stepped outside, slamming the door behind her. The fresh air hit her face, bringing a fleeting sense of relief, but it did little to chase away the frustration boiling inside her. The guest house sat on the edge of the sprawling fields of the estate, with acres of land stretching out before her. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the neatly arranged rows of crops, and the distant hills provided a picturesque backdrop. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even, but Amanda felt none of that. She began walking, her steps quick and deliberate, as if putting distance between herself and the house would somehow ease the anger churning inside her. She had no real destination in mind, nor did she care where she was going. All she knew was that she could not stay in that house any longer, trapped with Daniel and the reality of what her life had become. As she wandered through the estate, memories of her old life flooded her mind: shopping in Manhattan, extravagant dinners at the most exclusive restaurants, luxury vacations on private islands. Everything she had once taken for granted was now gone. Her father had ripped it all away with this cruel punishment, and now she was stuck in this nightmare. She kicked at the dirt path, sending small pebbles flying into the grass. "This is so ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "I should not be here. I should not be stuck with him." For a while, she just walked, allowing the landscape to unfold around her, her mind swirling with resentment. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she knew she could not avoid the inevitable forever. Eventually, she would have to return to the house. Daniel would still be there, quiet and patient, waiting for her to acknowledge him. She hated how calm he was, how he seemed to accept their situation without complaint. It infuriated her. By the time she made her way back to the guest house, the kitchen was empty. Daniel had cleaned up the breakfast dishes and disappeared, likely off tending to the estate's gardens. Amanda felt a brief flicker of guilt, knowing he had made an effort to be kind, but she quickly buried it. This was not about kindness. This was about the fact that her life had been turned upside down, and no amount of scrambled eggs was going to fix that. She wandered into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The hours dragged on, one after the other, as Amanda struggled to figure out what she was supposed to do now. There were no more parties to attend, no more shopping sprees, no more distractions. Her days of luxury were over, at least for the foreseeable future. As the sun began to set, she heard the door creak open. Daniel stepped inside, his face flushed from a day's work outdoors. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at her, his gaze searching for something, understanding, maybe, or an indication that she was softening. "I am making dinner," he said after a moment. "You are welcome to join me." Amanda did not respond. She simply stared at him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Daniel held her gaze for a beat before turning toward the kitchen without another word. The sound of pots and pans clattering filled the silence, and for a brief moment, Amanda considered leaving again just to avoid the awkwardness. But something stopped her, something she could not quite explain. As she sat there, listening to the familiar sounds of cooking, Amanda came to a quiet realization. Daniel was not fighting her. He was not pushing back against her anger or her resentment. He was giving her space, letting her process this in her own time. It was frustrating, but at the same time, there was something oddly grounding about it. Still, she was not ready to let her guard down. Not yet. If her father thought she would simply accept this marriage and move on, he was wrong. Very wrong. Amanda woke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a far cry from the hum of traffic and the pulse of the city she was used to. For a brief second, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed down on her like a weight. She was still in the guest house, still stuck in this forced marriage. And nothing had changed. She sighed, sitting up and brushing the hair from her face. Through the small window, she spotted Daniel already at work in the garden. He was bent over a row of plants, carefully tending to each one with a precision that suggested he truly cared about what he was doing. Even from a distance, she could see the quiet focus etched onto his face. It was as if the entire world faded away when he was working in the soil. Amanda stood by the window, watching him for a moment. She had never understood people like Daniel, people who found satisfaction in simple things. To her, life had always been about movement, about high-end living and instant gratification. But to Daniel, it seemed a day spent working with his hands was enough. It did not make sense to her, but at the same time, she could not help but feel a strange curiosity. What was it like to live a life where nothing was rushed, where everything had its own natural rhythm, where satisfaction came from hard work rather than excess? Shaking her head, she turned away from the window and went about her morning routine. She was not interested in understanding Daniel or his lifestyle. She was just waiting for an opportunity to leave, to return to her real life, her real world. But that opportunity did not seem to be coming anytime soon. Later that day, as Amanda wandered the estate, she found herself near the garden where Daniel worked. She had not planned to talk to him, but something about the sight of him among the plants caught her attention. She kept her distance, watching from the edge of the garden as he moved methodically from one section to another, his hands deftly pruning and shaping the greenery. There was something almost rhythmic about the way he worked, a quiet grace in his movements. It was different from the kind of ambition she had grown up around, her father's world of business deals and high-stakes negotiations. This was something else entirely. It was slower, deliberate, and somehow strangely peaceful. As Amanda watched him, she noticed something she had not expected. There was no frustration in Daniel's movements, no rush to finish the job. Every action seemed deliberate, as though he took pleasure in the process itself rather than just the result. He would pause every so often to wipe the sweat from his brow or examine a plant more closely, as if nothing outside the garden existed. She found herself oddly fascinated by the way he worked. There was something calming about it, even though she still did not understand how he could be content with such a simple life. After a while, Daniel seemed to sense her presence and looked up, catching her eye from across the garden. He straightened, brushed the dirt off his hands, and gave her a small smile. "Hey," he said, walking over to where she stood. "I did not think you would be out here." Amanda shrugged, crossing her arms. "I did not have anything better to do." Daniel nodded, glancing back at the garden. "I guess that is fair. It is not exactly exciting around here, but it is peaceful." "Peaceful?" Amanda echoed, her tone almost mocking. "Is that really what you want? Just peace?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "I guess so. I have never really wanted more than that." Amanda looked at him, incredulous. "You have never wanted anything more? No ambitions? No dreams?" Daniel smiled, but there was something deeper in his eyes, something Amanda could not quite place. "Ambition is not really my thing. I like knowing I can wake up every day and do something I love. There is something satisfying about seeing something grow, knowing I had a hand in making it happen." Amanda frowned. She could not understand how someone could be content with so little. But then again, Daniel did not seem like the type to chase after wealth or status. He was different. You do not get bored? She asked, genuinely curious. Daniel laughed softly. Not really. There is always something to do, something to fix, something to grow. It is not boring when you appreciate the little things. Amanda did not respond. She was not sure how to process what he was saying. The little things, she had never cared about the little things. Life was supposed to be big and grand, full of excitement and luxury. But as she stood there, watching Daniel talk about the garden, she realized that maybe she had been missing something. Not that she was ready to admit that, of course. Well, good for you, I guess, Amanda muttered, brushing off the thought. But I still think it is ridiculous. Daniel just smiled, unfazed by her dismissal. You do not have to understand it, Amanda. It is just who I am. A long pause stretched between them, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filling the silence. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of Daniel's words settle over her like a blanket she did not want but could not shake off. You should try it sometime, Daniel said after a moment, his voice light but sincere. You might be surprised. Amanda scoffed, rolling her eyes. Yeah, right. Me? Gardening? Not going to happen. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Suit yourself. Without another word, he turned and went back to work, leaving Amanda standing there, watching him again. She felt something unfamiliar stir inside her, a mixture of confusion and intrigue. She did not understand Daniel, and part of her did not want to. But there was another part, a small part, that wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth learning from him. But she quickly pushed the thought away. She was not going to fall for the simplicity of Daniel's life. She had a world waiting for her. A world of luxury, excitement, and power. This was temporary. It had to be. Yet, as she turned to walk back toward the guest house, Amanda could not help but glance back at Daniel one last time, feeling a tug of something deep within her that she was not quite ready to acknowledge. Days passed in the small guest house, and Amanda found herself slipping into a routine that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. She still felt trapped by the circumstances, still resented the situation her father had forced upon her. But something was shifting. Slowly, against her will, she was starting to notice things she had never cared to see before. It began with the mornings. Amanda would wake up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of the guest house. At first, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, dreading the day ahead. But over time, she started to listen to the sounds of the estate waking up, to the breeze that rustled the leaves, to the distant hum of life outside the walls she had built around herself. Daniel was always up before her, out in the garden or working around the estate, his quiet presence as steady as the sunrise. And though she had once resented his calm demeanor, now she found it oddly reassuring. He never pushed her, never demanded anything of her. He was just there. Amanda still kept her distance, of course. She was not about to suddenly embrace this new life or fall into some picture-perfect romance with the gardener. But she could not deny that something had changed. One morning, as she stood by the window watching Daniel work, she caught herself feeling a twinge of admiration. He moved through the garden with a kind of grace, his hands skillfully tending to the plants as though he knew them intimately. There was a rhythm to his work, a quiet confidence that came from years of experience, and despite herself, Amanda could not help but respect it. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. She was not quite sure when it started, but little by little she found herself paying attention to the world around her, the bright colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of the wind as it swept through the fields. These were things she had never noticed before. In her old life, everything had been about speed and indulgence, about getting what she wanted when she wanted it. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, things moved slower, and for the first time, Amanda began to wonder if that was such a bad thing. One afternoon, as she sat outside reading a book, Daniel approached her. He was carrying a basket of fresh vegetables, his shirt stained with dirt from a day's work. Mind if I sit? He asked, nodding toward the empty chair beside her. Amanda shrugged, not looking up from her book. Do whatever you want. Daniel smiled slightly and took the seat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not entirely uncomfortable, but it was not exactly warm either. It was something in between, awkward yet familiar, like the quiet shared between two people who knew each other well but not well enough. I have been thinking, Daniel said after a while, breaking the silence, about you being here, about how things have been. Amanda glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow. Oh yeah? And what have you been thinking? Daniel did not look at her directly. Instead, he kept his eyes on the basket of vegetables in front of him, his fingers idly playing with a stalk of celery. I know this is not what you wanted. I get that. But I do not know, it does not have to be so bad, does it? Amanda scoffed, her usual defensiveness kicking in. So bad? Daniel, I am living in a guest house on my father's estate, married to someone I barely know because I was forced into it. You really think this is not so bad? Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. I am not saying it is ideal, but you have been here for a while now. You have seen how things are. Maybe it is not what you are used to, but it is not the worst, right? Amanda did not answer right away. She wanted to snap back at him, to tell him how ridiculous it was to suggest that her situation was anything less than miserable. But the words caught in her throat, because the truth was, she was not sure anymore. She did not know how to feel about any of this. I am not asking you to love it here, Daniel continued. I just think maybe there is something worth appreciating. Something small, you know? Amanda rolled her eyes, but there was no real bite behind it. What, like gardening? Is that what you are suggesting? Daniel smiled again, a little more genuine this time. Maybe. You might be surprised. You are always welcome to join me. Amanda shook her head, but she could not help the small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Yeah, I do not think so. They sat in silence for a while longer, the conversation fading as the day cooled. Amanda watched as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. There was something peaceful about the way the light filtered through the trees, the way the air settled into a quiet hum as evening approached. For the first time, Amanda did not feel the urge to leave. She was still angry at her father, still frustrated with her situation, but something inside her had shifted. She was starting to see the world around her differently, noticing the beauty in things she had once dismissed. She glanced over at Daniel, who was watching the sunset with a quiet contentment. There was something about him that made her pause, something she could not quite put her finger on. He was not like anyone she had ever known. He did not care about wealth, power, or status. He cared about simple things, things Amanda had never given a second thought. And maybe, just maybe, there was something in that. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Amanda stood up, stretching her arms above her head. I am going inside, she said, her tone casual. Daniel nodded, not looking away from the horizon. All right. See you later. As she walked back to the guest house, Amanda realized she did not hate being here as much as she used to. It was not perfect, and she still was not sure what her future looked like. But for the first time in a long time, she did not feel completely lost. There was something peaceful about this place. And maybe, just maybe, there was something peaceful about Daniel too. The days seemed to blur together as Amanda continued to live in the quiet solitude of the guest house. Her mornings were filled with the sound of birds and the soft rustle of the vineyard leaves. Daniel's calm, steady presence had become something she expected, like the sunrise or the warm breeze that swept through the fields in the afternoon. But as much as things around her felt peaceful, inside, she was still a storm of emotions. Amanda could not deny the changes she felt. The anger she once harbored so fiercely was softening, and she hated it. She did not want to let go of that fire. It had fueled her, given her a purpose. But now she found herself questioning everything. What was she still angry about? Her father's manipulation? Yes, that had not changed. But her life here with Daniel? That was becoming harder to hate. She sat on the porch one afternoon, legs curled up beneath her as she stared out at the vineyard. The sun was warm on her skin, but her thoughts were dark. She hated that she did not have an easy answer anymore. Before, it had been simple. She resented Daniel, she resented her father, and she resented the entire situation. But now, there were moments when she felt not happy, exactly, but at peace. And that scared her more than anything. Daniel was out working as he usually was during the day. And Amanda found herself watching him more and more. Not in a romantic way, she was not ready to even consider that. But there was something about him that drew her in. He was so steady, so content with the world he had built for himself, even though it was small and simple. It was everything she had once despised. Yet now, she could not help but wonder if there was more to life than what she had been chasing all these years. Her mind wandered back to the conversation they had a few days ago when he suggested she might find something to appreciate here. At the time, she had scoffed. But now, maybe he had been right. Maybe there was something to be learned from this life. But that realization brought its own set of problems. If she admitted there was value in this simplicity, what did that say about the person she had been before? Had her entire life up to this point been shallow and meaningless? Amanda shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She was not ready for that kind of reflection. She had built her identity on being a woman of luxury and status, someone who lived for the finer things in life. And yet here she was, sitting in a small guest house, questioning everything. As the day wore on, Amanda found herself wandering outside again, unable to sit still. She walked through the vineyard, letting her fingers brush the leaves of the grapevines as she passed. The air was cool now, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of plants. It was beautiful in a way she had never noticed before. When she reached the edge of the property, she found Daniel sitting on a small stone wall, his hands resting in his lap as he looked out over the vineyard. He seemed lost in thought, and for a moment Amanda hesitated. She was not sure why she had come looking for him, but now that she was here, she did not know what to say. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. Daniel looked up, surprised to see her. "Hey," he replied, giving her a small smile. "Everything all right?" Amanda shrugged, not sure how to answer that. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house." Daniel nodded, scooting over on the wall to make room for her. "Sit," he offered. She hesitated for a moment but eventually sat down next to him. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound being the soft rustle of the vineyard and the distant chirping of crickets. It was peaceful, but Amanda's mind was anything but calm. "I do not get you," she finally said, breaking the quiet. Daniel turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I do not get how you can be so okay with all of this," Amanda explained, gesturing around her. "This life, it is so small. Do you not ever want more?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I think it depends on what you mean by more." "I mean bigger, better, more excitement, more success, more money," Amanda said, frustration creeping into her voice. "You are content with so little." "How?" Daniel smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that caught Amanda off guard. "I guess it comes down to what you value. For me, it is not about the money or the excitement. It is about the work, about knowing that I am creating something, growing something. That is enough for me." Amanda shook her head, unable to wrap her mind around it. "But do you not feel like you are missing out?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Maybe to some people it might seem like I am, but I have never felt that way. I think people can get so caught up in chasing more that they forget to appreciate what they have right in front of them." His words hit Amanda harder than she expected. She had spent her entire life chasing more money, more status, more attention. And now here she was, sitting with someone who was completely content with so much less. It made her question everything. "I do not know if I can be like that," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I have always needed more." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It is not about being like me, Amanda. It is about figuring out what makes you happy, what really matters to you." Amanda did not respond. She did not know how to. For the first time, she realized that she did not have an answer to that question. She had spent so long chasing things that did not really matter. And now that she was forced to confront that, it left her feeling empty. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the vineyard in a warm golden glow, Amanda felt something inside her shift. She was not ready to admit it yet, but she could feel the edges of her old life starting to blur. And as much as she hated it, there was a part of her that was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Daniel was onto something. Amanda paced the small living room of the guest house, her heart pounding in her chest. She had not felt this kind of nervous energy in weeks, not since the day of the wedding. But today was different. Today she was going to confront her father. The idea had been simmering in her mind for days, ever since that conversation with Daniel by the vineyard. Something had shifted inside her, and though she was not entirely sure what it meant yet, she knew one thing for certain. She could not keep living under the shadow of her father's control. The thought of facing him filled her with both dread and determination. James Walker had always been larger than life, a man whose presence dominated every room he entered. Growing up, she had learned quickly that defying him came with consequences, and this marriage had been the ultimate proof of that. But now, standing in the quiet of the guest house, Amanda felt a surge of strength she had not felt before. She was tired of living by his rules, tired of letting him dictate her every move. She glanced out the window at the vineyard, where Daniel was working as usual. There was something grounding about his steady presence, even from a distance. Amanda knew she did not have to do this, but she also knew that if she did not confront her father now, she might never get the chance to break free. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The path to the main house seemed longer than usual, the vineyard stretching out like an endless maze of green and gold. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking toward a final showdown that had been building for years. When she reached the front door of the mansion, she paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Memories of her life here flashed through her mind. The lavish parties, the high-end fashion, the constant buzz of wealth and power. It had all seemed so important back then. Now, it felt distant, like a different life entirely. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The grand foyer was just as she remembered it, cold and imposing. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light, but there was no warmth in the space. It was a monument to her father's success, a reminder of everything he had built and everything he had demanded in return. James was in his office, of course, the place where he spent most of his time these days. Amanda could hear the faint sound of his voice through the closed door, probably on a business call. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should wait until he was done, but then her resolve hardened. No more waiting. She knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. James looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, his phone in one hand, papers scattered in front of him. His eyes narrowed when he saw her, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Amanda," he said, his tone sharp. "I am on a call. This better be important." She crossed her arms over her chest, standing her ground. "It is." James held up a finger, signaling her to wait while he finished his conversation. Amanda stood there, her jaw clenched, watching as he barked orders into the phone. It was a familiar sight, her father, the powerful businessman, always in control. But today Amanda was not going to let him brush her off. Finally, he hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "What is it you want, Amanda?" "I am busy." She took a deep breath, her heart racing. "We need to talk about the wedding. About this arrangement." James's expression did not change, but she could see the flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, is my daughter finally coming to her senses? Ready to beg for an annulment?" Amanda shook her head, her voice steady. "No, that is not why I am here." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what? You have been living in the guest house for weeks now. Surely you are not enjoying it?" "I am not here to talk about what I enjoy," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. Amanda squared her shoulders, her voice steady. "I am here to tell you that I am done letting you control me. You forced me into that marriage because you thought it would teach me a lesson, but it did not work." James's expression darkened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. Amanda took a step closer, her confidence growing. "You thought marrying Daniel would be some kind of punishment, but it is not. I have learned more about myself in the last few weeks than I ever did living under your control. And I am not going to let you keep running my life." James stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Is that so? And what exactly do you plan to do, Amanda? Run off with the gardener and live happily ever after?" Amanda met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Maybe I will. And if I do, it will be because it is my choice, not yours." James's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You are being ridiculous. Do you really think you can throw away everything I have built for you? Everything this family has worked for?" Amanda did not flinch. "It is not your life to control, Dad. It is mine." The tension in the room was thick, neither of them willing to back down. Amanda could see the struggle in her father's eyes, the conflict between his desire to control her and the realization that he was losing his grip. "You have always been stubborn," James said finally, his voice low. "But do not forget who you are dealing with. I am the one who made this family what it is. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Amanda shook her head. "You gave me everything except the freedom to live my own life." There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words settling in the room. For the first time, Amanda saw something shift in her father's expression. It was not anger or disappointment. It was something deeper, something closer to regret. But James Walker was not a man to admit defeat easily. He straightened his shoulders, his voice cold and calculated once more. You want your freedom, Amanda? Fine. But do not come crying to me when you realize that life out there is not as easy as you think. Amanda nodded, her heart still racing but her mind clearer than it had been in years. I will not. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving her father behind. As the door clicked shut behind her, she felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been intense, but it was over. She had said what she needed to say, and for the first time in a long time, Amanda felt like she was in control of her own life. The confrontation with her father had left Amanda feeling a mixture of emotions, anger, relief, and an odd sense of freedom she had not expected. For the first time in her life, she had stood up to James, and while the conversation had been tense, it also felt like a turning point. She was not entirely sure what her next move was, but one thing was certain: she was not going back to the life of luxury and control her father had built for her. When she returned to the guest house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the vineyard. Daniel was outside, kneeling by one of the flower beds, his hands covered in dirt as he worked with quiet concentration. Amanda watched him for a moment, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. It had been weeks since their forced marriage, and though things had been awkward and tense at first, something had shifted between them. Daniel's patience and quiet resilience had surprised her, and over time she had come to appreciate the simple kindness he showed her. He never pushed her, never asked for anything in return. And now, after the confrontation with her father, she found herself drawn to that quiet stability. Daniel looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. You are back, he said, his voice soft but welcoming. How did it go? Amanda sat down on the small stone bench near the garden, letting out a long breath. It was intense, she admitted, but I finally told him what I needed to say. Daniel nodded, standing up and walking over to sit beside her. Good. It is about time. Amanda smiled faintly, glancing over at him. You think so? Yeah, Daniel said, his tone gentle but firm. You have been carrying that around for a long time. It is good that you finally got it off your chest. Amanda leaned back, staring up at the sky as the colors shifted from orange to pink. I just do not know what comes next. I feel like I am floating between two worlds, the life I had before and this one. I do not know where I belong anymore. Daniel was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Maybe you do not have to choose right now. Maybe you can just be. She looked over at him, surprised by the simplicity of his answer. Just be? He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah. Life does not always have to be about making big decisions or having everything figured out. Sometimes it is okay to just live. See where it takes you. Amanda thought about that for a moment, turning the idea over in her mind. She had always lived with a sense of urgency, a need to be in control, to know exactly what was coming next. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe she did not have to have all the answers right now. I am not used to that, she admitted, her voice softer now. I have always had a plan. Even when I was rebelling against my father, I was still chasing something. Daniel leaned back on the bench, his arm brushing against hers as they sat in comfortable silence. I get that, but plans can change. People change. Amanda glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat at the way his words seemed to echo something deeper inside her. Over the past few weeks, she had begun to see Daniel in a new light. He was not just the gardener her father had forced her to marry. He was kind, patient, and steady. Everything she had not realized she needed. For the first time, Amanda allowed herself to really look at Daniel. He was handsome in a rugged, unassuming way, with his strong jawline and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. But more than that, there was a warmth to him, a quiet strength that she had come to rely on without even realizing it. What about you? She asked, turning the conversation back to him. Do you have a plan? Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. I do not think I have ever had much of a plan. I like things simple. I take life as it comes. Amanda smiled, feeling a flutter in her chest she had not expected. That sounds nice. He looked at her, his expression softening. It can be. The air between them seemed to shift, and for a moment, Amanda felt like the world around them had gone quiet. She had not planned on feeling anything for Daniel. But here she was, sitting beside him, her heart racing at the way he was looking at her. Daniel, she began, her voice hesitant, about this marriage. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Amanda took a deep breath, her words slow and careful. "I know we did not have a choice," she said. "And I know things have not been ideal. But I think I am starting to see things differently." Daniel did not say anything, but the way he looked at her made her feel like he already knew what she was trying to say. Amanda's pulse quickened as she continued. "I guess what I am trying to say is, maybe this does not have to be a punishment. Maybe we can make it something more." Daniel's eyes softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the vineyard in the evening breeze. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. Amanda nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I think it is." Daniel's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Then we will figure it out together." The simplicity of his words filled Amanda with a sense of peace she had not felt in a long time. There were still so many unknowns, so many things she had not figured out. But for the first time, that did not scare her. She was not alone in this anymore. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Amanda felt a new kind of warmth bloom inside her. One that had nothing to do with the wealth or status she had once chased. This was different. This was real. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days after Amanda's conversation with Daniel were filled with a new sense of clarity, though not without a lingering hesitation. She had finally admitted to herself that her feelings for Daniel were real, that maybe this forced marriage did not have to be the punishment she had once believed. But with that realization came the need to make a decision that would change her life completely. She knew the time had come to make things official, to stand in front of Daniel, not as two people forced into a marriage by her father's will, but as equals, as partners. It was not something she had ever expected for herself, but it was something she had come to want more than anything. One morning, as the sun rose over the vineyard, Amanda sat on the porch of the guest house, deep in thought. She held a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin as she watched the world wake up around her. The vineyard, once a symbol of confinement, now felt like home. The quiet, the simplicity, it had grown on her in ways she never could have predicted. But she could not stay in this in-between state forever. She had to take control of her life, to make the choice she had been avoiding. That afternoon, she found Daniel in the garden as usual. He was kneeling by one of the flower beds, his hands gently pruning the plants with the same careful attention he always showed. There was something comforting about the way he worked, something that made Amanda feel grounded even when her mind was racing. "Daniel," she called softly, stepping closer. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "Hey," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Everything okay?" Amanda nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I need to talk to you." Daniel's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and concern. "Sure. What is on your mind?" Amanda took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She was not used to being vulnerable, but with Daniel, it felt different. It felt safe. "I have been thinking," she began, her voice softer than she intended, "about us, about everything that has happened since the wedding." Daniel remained silent, giving her space to speak. "I know we did not have a choice in this," she continued, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I know my father forced both of us into this situation, and at first I hated it. I hated you. I hated this place. I hated everything." Daniel smiled faintly, but he did not interrupt. "But now," Amanda went on, "now things are different. I do not feel trapped anymore. I do not feel like this is some kind of punishment. In fact, I think I might actually be happy here." Her words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of them settling between them like a shared secret. Daniel's eyes softened and he took a step closer, his voice gentle. "What are you saying, Amanda?" Amanda looked down at the ground, gathering her thoughts. "I am saying that I want this. I want to be here with you. Not because my father forced me into it, but because it is what I choose." Daniel's expression was unreadable for a moment, as if he was processing what she had just said. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, a real, genuine smile that made Amanda's heart flutter in her chest. "You are serious?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of hope. Amanda nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. "Yeah, I am serious." Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, in a sudden rush of emotion, he reached out and pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly against him. Amanda closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart against hers. "I never thought I would hear you say that," Daniel murmured, his voice full of emotion. Amanda laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look up at him. Neither did I. They stood there for a long moment, the world around them quiet and still. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amanda felt truly at peace. There was no more anger, no more resentment. Just the quiet understanding that this was where she was meant to be. After a while, Daniel pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on her shoulders. "So, what does this mean?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. Amanda smiled, feeling a sense of excitement she had not expected. "It means I want to make this real. I want to renew our vows on our own terms this time." Daniel blinked, clearly surprised. "You mean it?" Amanda nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I want to marry you. For real." For a moment, Daniel was speechless. Then, a wide grin spread across his face, and he pulled her into another hug, this time lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle. Amanda laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, Daniel looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, one of pure joy. "I do not know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Amanda smiled, her heart full. "Just say yes." Daniel laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes. Absolutely yes." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the vineyard stretching out around them like a quiet witness to the moment. It was simple, but it was perfect. And for the first time, Amanda did not feel like she was chasing something. She had found exactly what she needed. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, they walked hand in hand back to the guest house, talking about the future in a way they had not before. It was different now. It was real. And when they reached the house, Amanda stopped on the porch, turning to look at Daniel with a smile that came from somewhere deep inside her. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Let us do it tomorrow." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with happiness. Tomorrow. They stood there, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over them, and Amanda knew, without a doubt, that she had made the right choice. The day after Amanda made her decision felt like a fresh start, but not everyone welcomed the news with open arms. James Walker had always believed he was in control, that his power and influence could shape the world around him, including his daughter's life. But the events of the past few weeks had shaken that belief. And now, for the first time, he was faced with the reality that he might have lost control entirely. James sat in his office as usual, surrounded by the familiar trappings of his wealth and success. The polished wood of his desk gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, and the scent of rich leather and old money filled the air. It was a space that radiated power, and James had always taken comfort in that. But today there was no comfort. There was only unease. He had been avoiding thinking about Amanda ever since their confrontation. He told himself she was just being stubborn, that she would eventually come to her senses and beg for his forgiveness. But as the days passed and he heard nothing from her, doubt began to creep into his mind. He could not understand why she was not fighting harder to escape the life he had forced upon her. He had expected her to rebel, to come crawling back, desperate to be freed from her marriage to Daniel. But instead, she had done the opposite. She had stayed. And now word had reached him that she was planning to renew her vows with Daniel, this time of her own volition. The thought infuriated him. How could his daughter, his only child, choose a life so beneath her? How could she turn her back on everything he had built for her? James stood abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he stared out the window at the vineyard below. The vineyard had always been a source of pride for him, a symbol of his success. But now it felt like a prison, a place where his daughter had slipped from his grasp. He had tried everything to mold Amanda into the person he wanted her to be. He had given her the best of everything, money, education, opportunities, and yet none of it had worked. She was still slipping away from him, choosing a life that, in his eyes, was nothing short of a betrayal. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. He turned to see his assistant, Maria, standing in the doorway, her expression cautious. "Mr. Walker," she began, her voice hesitant. "Your daughter is here to see you." James's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his emotions. "Send her in," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. Maria nodded and disappeared down the hallway, and a few moments later Amanda stepped into the office. She looked different, more confident, more at ease with herself than he had ever seen her before. It unsettled him. "Amanda," James said, his tone clipped. "What is this about?" Amanda took a deep breath, standing tall in front of him. "I am here to tell you that I am renewing my vows with Daniel." James's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. So I have heard. And what exactly do you expect me to say to that? I am not here to ask for your permission, Amanda replied, her voice steady. I am here to tell you because I think you deserve to know. But this is my life and I am choosing how to live it. James's eyes narrowed, his temper flaring. You are choosing to throw everything away? Is that what you are telling me? I am not throwing anything away, Amanda said, her voice calm but firm. I am choosing a life that makes me happy. A life where I get to be myself. And what about the life I built for you? James demanded, his voice rising. The wealth, the opportunities, everything I have worked for? You are just going to walk away from all of it? Amanda met his gaze without flinching. You built that life for yourself, Dad. Not for me. I never asked for any of it. The words hit James like a slap to the face. He had always believed that everything he did was for Amanda, that all his hard work and success were for her benefit. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that he had been wrong. He had never considered what she wanted, only what he thought was best for her. You are making a mistake, James said, his voice low and dangerous. Daniel is beneath you. He will never be able to give you the life you deserve. Amanda shook her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. That is where you are wrong. Daniel is exactly what I need. He is kind. He is steady. And he loves me for who I am, not for what I have. James's hands curled into fists at his sides. You think love is enough? You think you can live on love alone? You are being naive, Amanda. I am being happy, she shot back, her voice filled with more confidence than James had ever heard from her. And I am not going to let you take that away from me. The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension between them palpable. James stared at his daughter, his mind racing. He had always been able to control her, to bend her to his will. But now, for the first time, he saw that control slipping away. And for the first time, he felt something he was not used to feeling, fear. Fear that he had lost her for good. Amanda took a step toward the door, her voice softening slightly. I love you, Dad. I always will. But I need to live my own life now. And I hope one day you will understand that. James did not respond. He could not. His throat felt tight and his mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and regret. As Amanda turned and walked out of the office, the door closing softly behind her, James was left standing in the silence of his office, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. He had tried to control Amanda's life, and in doing so, he had pushed her away. And now she was gone. Daniel sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty space where his daughter had stood. He had always believed that power and control were the keys to success, that if he held on to them tightly enough, he could shape the world around him. But now, he realized there were some things he could not control. And the price for that realization was Amanda. The day Amanda had been waiting for arrived with a sense of calm that felt almost surreal. The sun was just beginning to rise over the vineyard, casting a soft golden light across the rows of grapevines. The air was cool and still. This time, the day felt different from her wedding months ago. Back then, it had felt like a punishment, a consequence of her father's will. Today, it felt like freedom. Today, she was making her own choice. She stood in front of the small mirror in the guest house, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was not the grand, extravagant gown she might have once imagined for herself, but it was perfect. It was a reflection of the new life she was about to embrace, a life not defined by luxury or status, but by love and authenticity. Amanda took a deep breath, her heart fluttering with anticipation. She had not felt this kind of excitement in a long time. The last few weeks had been filled with moments of self-reflection, realizations, and growth. She had come to terms with the fact that the life she once thought she wanted was not the life she needed. Daniel had helped her see that, not by forcing her to change, but by simply being himself. A steady, kind presence who showed her that happiness could be found in the simplest things. There was a knock at the door, pulling her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Daniel stood there, dressed in a simple suit, his hair neatly combed. He looked at her with the same calm, loving gaze he had always had. But today there was something else in his eyes, something deeper, more certain. You look beautiful, Daniel said softly, his smile warm and genuine. Amanda felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Thank you, she replied, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. You look pretty good yourself. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. The weight of everything they had been through settled between them like a shared secret. This was not just a renewal of vows, it was a new beginning. A beginning they were choosing together. Ready? Daniel asked, holding out his hand. Amanda nodded, slipping her hand into his. More than ever. They walked together to the small clearing in the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. It was a simple setup, just a few chairs, a wooden arch decorated with wildflowers, and the rows of grapevines stretching out behind them. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh earth, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze was the only sound that accompanied their steps. There were no guests, no grand celebration. It was just the two of them standing side by side, ready to make this commitment on their own terms. And for the first time in her life, Amanda did not care about the absence of an audience or the lack of extravagance. This was what she wanted, something real, something true. The officiant, a kind woman from the nearby town, smiled as they approached. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her voice gentle. Amanda and Daniel exchanged a glance, both smiling. "Let us do it," Amanda said, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and peace. As the officiant began to speak, Amanda felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She glanced at Daniel, who was watching her with that same steady gaze, and she realized how much they had both changed since the day of their forced marriage. Back then, they had been strangers, two people thrown into a situation neither of them had wanted. But now they were something more. They were partners, equals, bound not by obligation but by choice. When it came time to say their vows, Amanda took a deep breath and turned to face Daniel, her heart pounding in her chest. The words she had prepared felt inadequate, but she knew that what mattered most was the truth behind them. "Daniel," she began, her voice soft but clear, "when we first got married, I did not understand what love was. I did not know what it meant to be truly happy. I thought I had to chase after things, wealth, status, approval. But you showed me that happiness is not about what you have. It is about who you share your life with. You have taught me more about love, kindness, and patience than I ever thought possible. And today I choose you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I choose you to be my partner, my friend, and my love for the rest of my life." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, but there was a tenderness to it that made Amanda's heart ache in the best way. "Amanda," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "I never expected this. I never expected to find someone like you, especially in the way that we did. But from the moment we started this journey together, I knew that there was something special about you. You are strong, determined, and so full of life. And every day, you have shown me that love is not about grand gestures or fancy things. It is about the little moments, the quiet ones, when we are just together. I choose you. Amanda, I choose you today, tomorrow, and every day after that. And I am so lucky to be standing here with you, knowing that this is just the beginning of our story." Tears welled up in Amanda's eyes as the officiant smiled and pronounced them husband and wife once again. There was no applause, no cheers from a crowd, but it did not matter. This moment was perfect just the way it was. Daniel leaned in and kissed her gently, and Amanda felt a sense of completeness settle over her. This was her life now, a life she had chosen, not because of what it looked like to others, but because of what it felt like to her. As they walked back through the vineyard, hand in hand, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, Amanda glanced up at Daniel, her heart full of love and gratitude. "I never thought I would find this," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Daniel smiled, his arm wrapping around her waist. "Neither did I." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the peaceful sounds of the vineyard surrounding them. There was no need for words. They both knew what this day meant, a new beginning, a fresh start, and the promise of a future filled with love, joy, and the simple beauty of life together. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Amanda looked out at the vineyard, feeling the warmth of Daniel's hand in hers, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.